Our next intervention will be about talking about innovation in the water innovation, European experiences and its appliance in Mexican context. We will analyze the integration of adaptation policies for resiliency for climate change. Different basins will be used as reference, and specifically making reference to different action plans, national speaking, European Union, and Mexico. So I would like to introduce Mario López Pérez. He has a master on science on Reading University in UK and the use of water resources by the State University in Colorado and Sao Paulo. He also has different topics, including 42 years of experience in the water sector in Mexico, 10 years as engineering manager in binational affairs in INTA. From 2019, he's a consultant of World Bank in different regions in more than 12 countries in South Africa and also Middle East and North Africa. He also has experience on Global Water Alliance adaptation and different topics in UK, in UN, in different backgrounds. Its experience on climate change and water treatment with water resources takes him to topics regarding public policies, legislations, and reasons why he is in this great project along with us as a leader of this project. He has a lot of experience on international forums, including the UN Water Consultation in 2023 and also forums and other forums in UNESCO, among others. And if that wouldn't be enough, he also received the National Prize Francisco Torres Herrera on Professional Matters for Water by the Water Mexican Association. So I would like to introduce Mario. That for the next 30 minutes. He will be talking about the next one, and then 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Kathy, and our friends from the EU. What I'm going to be presenting, it's like the baseline of where we are now. Because unfortunately, there's not enough information when it comes to adaptation. The basic problem is that Mexico was completely focused on mitigation and forgot about adaptation. And I'm going to explain why. So Kathy, Laura talked about this. We talk about adaptation and resilience. This is the internationally accepted definition. And why am I showing you this? Because many countries, including Mexico, sometimes we carry out certain actions that say to be adaptation measures, and they are not really that. A while ago, Laura was talking about a document recently published by the EU this year, the risk assessment on climate change. They identify 36 risks, and they correlate them with the different sectors that they can have an impact on. And essentially, in some European countries, they are doing actions that say to be adaptation measures, and they are not really that. Adaptation is to adequate to the new condition of the weather. And resilience is that once this impact is inevitable, which is already inevitable, we cannot go back to a condition that allow us to keep on functioning in the same way. So why is this relevant? Because the vision that Europeans have in their strategy document focused on 2050, they visualize themselves as a resilient society when it comes to climate change, and that it's totally adapted to the inevitable changes in the weather that are already happening. I was reading some news before about a community in Panama which is moving from their island because inevitably the sea level has risen. The government of Panama is moving them from this island to land. They are being provided with all the necessary activities to survive. Evidently, being an original population, their cosmovision and the way they face nature is different from the Western perspective. And what does this cause? That they will have to adapt to a new way of living. This is a forced adaptation because of the impact of the climate. And cases like this, we have been seeing them all over the world, but I wanted to refer to Latin America because it's similar to what we will suffer in Mexico. So, what are the components? And Laura already talked about this of the strategy of adaptation of the EU. I love this in English because they are very specific in what they want to get to this vision of 2050. And a smart adaptation on knowledge and managing uncertainty. Adaptation is the management of uncertainty. We will never have enough information to make decisions, but we can reduce uncertainty. Knowledge should be like the pillar of adaptation. Loss and risk, it's something that needs to be documented and it needs to be part of this smart adaptation. The European authorities are generating a platform that they share with all the different countries. The second relevant element or component of this European strategy is systemic work. Everything is related, the sectors, the regions, everything is related. And the strategy has to be improved to face it in this way. Something very relevant and that unfortunately in many of our countries, including Mexico, including the different governments are not doing. And what is that? The integration of climate resilience in the budgets of the countries, nations, and the states and municipalities. What am I referring to? That the allocation of budgets are not considering climate change. There's no criteria that will allow us to filter projects and actions because there's no risk assessment, climate risk. There's no doubt that the promotion of measures based on nature as specific actions, this is the systemic work, articulating science, the financial aspect, the field work. The third element on this European strategy is what in English is called the low-hanging fruit. That closest solution to us, the most important thing to address correctly. Reducing risk, but in order to reduce risk, we need to understand it. And unfortunately, we're going to see that in Mexico, the impact assessment, the vulnerability assessment, and the consequence risk assessment, they do not exist. And where they exist, they are not being updated. So we cannot really know how much we are reducing risk, how much we are reducing vulnerability in this imminent and growing impact. Something relevant that they have is connecting water to climate. In the European strategy, they aim to secure the availability in quantity and quality of water for all sectors. This means that water is not just a risk, it's also an opportunity and it's also a sector when it comes to climate. And that's how Europeans see it. There's no doubt that international participation to escalate this to the highest level is part of the strategy. They help each other in order to comply with these commitments, not just for mitigation, but also for adaptation. So, the global commitment of the Europeans towards the countries, as Laura was showing, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, etc., it's very clear in terms of cooperation for adaptation. And having said that, what's Mexico's situation? And we're not going to like what I'm going to show you, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. The legal framework, it's very complete. We have a general law on climate change. There are state laws on climate change. There are municipal arrangements and agreements about it. This is more focused on mitigation. It's not really focused on adaptation. So, what instruments does Mexico have? Well, there's a national strategy on climate change and a long term view. Mexico has been one of the countries that has been complying with this, and we have a national policy for adaptation. All the administrations, since this act was published, has special programs for climate change, which is cross-cutting to all sectors, the environment, agriculture, water, transportation, etc., according to the development plan. Also, in the states, there are programs for climate change, and unfortunately, they are only focused on mitigation, accountability of gases, reducing emissions, and also municipalities. We have been seeing several programs on climate change, and it's only mitigation. The law says it very clearly on Articles 11 and 71. The National Act on Climate Change, each state is forced to apply their own laws. Because we know that states have autonomy and we are a federal state. So each entity doesn't only have a law, but they also have their own state programs in terms of climate change. And we will see that they have something special. This information comes from a publication from 2022 done by Semarnat after the disappearance of INEC, and the information is coming back from INEC. This is a document called National Contribution for Adaptation to Climate Change. In that document, it is said that there are 27 entities of the 32 that have a law. 5 do not have any, even when the general law is forcing them to have one. 6 entities have a regulation. Not all of them have. The law is the how, and the regulation is the law is the what, and the regulation is the how. So, what are the states doing? This is truly something that we don't know. Of the 27 laws that have been published, only 19% is considering adaptation. In general terms, we have reviewed several of these laws, and it's just a definition. And there's a series of concepts on adaptation. 81% of these laws talk about specific things related to adaptation. 28 programs on climate change exist, and there are 4 entities that have never published one program. Of the 28 programs published, 4 mention NDC. There's no connection, no clear connection between the national commitment and the commitment of the states. everyone is aiming in different places, and sometimes we see some connection between them. Of the 28 programs on climate change, 25 are discussing vulnerability and adaptation on different levels. We're going to see a table. Semarnat did a 4-stage process and determined this assessment on how many of them were in each stage. 20 out of the 25, 13 talk about specific actions on adaptation. The most relevant thing is that many of these documents are not adapted, not updated. 14% of these acts were published before the General Act, and 53%, half of the documents on these national programs, were done before Semarnat issued the guidelines to elaborate these state plans. This means that we have to rebuild the whole framework on a subnational level in Mexico. The national framework, it's okay, but that has not permeated into the states. Here you have the matrix that you can find in this document published in 2022, where we have the 28 states, and that arrow is pointing at the states where we have Estado de México, Yucatán, Tamaulipas. You can see how many have vulnerability assessment, how many have design of adaptation measures, how many are already in implementation stages, and how many are monitoring and evaluating. We can see that the state of Mexico has a vulnerability evaluation, not updated. There's a design for adaptation measures, not updated, but at least it's not in implementation, and there's no monitoring. Tamaulipas has 4 elements. However, our colleagues will explain what's the situation there. And Yucatan has completed 4 stages, and our colleagues will share more about it. On a subnational level, there's a lot of things to do, a lot of things to rebuild, and the project that it's being performed together, perhaps it may be that milestone that will change this paradigm that we have on a subnational level. And I was saying, what's a national priority in terms of adaptation is not necessarily a priority on a subnational level. And I won't even go into the municipal level. Unfortunately, some national priorities in terms of adaptation are not coming from risk assessment on climate change. They are actions that came from a sort of adaptation, but that are not necessarily responding to the problem and reducing to the risk of climate change. And national priorities, evidently, some have permeated on a subnational level, but in general, we can say that there's no programming, there's no connection from top to bottom. The subnational priority, we never see, subnational priority is not feeding the national priority. So what are the priorities on a federal level? Biodiversity and ecosystem services. 24 of these state documents have that. Human population and disaster risk management, productive systems and food security, strategic water management, and tangible cultural heritage. These are the priorities on a subnational level. And this, if we look at this from the national perspective, this can have certain things in common, but not necessarily. These are examples of specific projects in Chiapas, in Jalisco, Guanajuato, Mexico City, and Campeche. These are subnational initiatives that are being executed or that were executed, but that are not necessarily coming from a national priority or a national interest, and even less from an international commitment established in the in NDC for their acronym in English. So what are we going to do now? So this means that these are the tools that we have been using in the Kutsamala project and that we have also shared with our colleagues from the other three projects or cases. The first one evidently has to do with the types of measures for adaptation, with the adaptation indicators used by the EU, a compilation of indicators and guidelines that the EU uses for all their members when they create national strategies. So looking closer, EU has a scoreboard adaptation, which is a framework that allow us to see the methodology step by step on how to perform this process. This is just a summary. I mean, it is very detailed in the document, and it is about preparing what the situation is like for adaptation, which is just establishing like the baseline for particular cases. You cannot have a good adaptation if we don't see how vulnerable we are. What is the risk that we are approaching? If not, it's just business as usual. Do the same thing that I was doing 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40. It's just an adaptation measure. We need to identify adaptation options, identify them, monitoring them. That's basically the sequence assessed by the SEMARNAT with information of the extinct inept. Another relevant element that is part of the same process is, well, the indicators. If I don't know how I'm truly measuring the impact, then I'm not doing my homework. The EU has a scheme. This is a case of Kutsamala, where we are associating institutional governance, economy, finance, or physical advance, technological solutions based on nature and the knowledge and behavior of the people, of society, because adaptation is for people to understand that they have to live in a different way and behave in a different way, because climate keeps on changing. It's not just this is a climate and it will be stable. No, unfortunately, that's not the case. I am not so optimistic. As Jose said, Javier, sorry, that we are close to the Paris agreements in terms of the levels and controls of temperature. Well, point here is that it's obvious that we are not going to comply. We are all behind, all the countries. Mexico is no exception to that. Mexico has not been very proactive. So to summarize, these indicators that the EU is proposing, they are very useful for this exercise. So here you have a practical application in case of Kutsamala. From these specific problems of Kutsamala, from the indicators, sub-indicators, specifications, and the proposed measure for adaptation. Using the European methodology and going to the level of a basin in Kutsamala, we have clarity of what needs to be done, knowing that what we are proposing has the support of indicators established by the EU that have been tested in other places in the world, and Latin America are also using it. So what problem do we have? in Cutzamala. I'm going to take one like randomly. There's no incentive to improve efficiency of water use in the communities and in agriculture. This is a problem from Guatemala. This obeys to the initial criteria of economy and finance. The sub-indicator is financial instruments that are necessary. The specification is we should create and review what already exists. In the case of Mexico, there is no incentive. So evidently, what we need is to have an incentive scheme for the effective use of water based on performance indicators. We need to strengthen to contain the growth and to protect these areas. These are economic incentives, so we don't see an increase in demand of water and to reduce the current demand. All of those that live in Mexico, including Frank, we know the condition and the state of Guatemala system. In these coming days, weeks, it's no longer going to be sending water to Mexico City. So it's a system that will be closed, and in this city, we will live with 30% less water. And distribution and limitations are going to be suffered by those that inhabit this city. So this measure of adaptation, of improving the situation, saving water is essential. Another problem with Guatemala, the budget for water management is not enough. It's from the same Ministry of Finance, and here we need to create new financing scheme. We need to align investment programs of the three areas of the government: federal, state, municipal, everything related to water, everything related to the use of soil, and everything related to environmental protection on the basin, focalizing that, because if we have budget execution for different things, we are going to dilute the impact and we're not going to reduce vulnerability or the risk in Guatemala. This is also part of the same matrix. For example, we have a problem with deforestation. The essential indicator here are schemes based on nature, green options, the creation of a new green infrastructure, signification of watering with accurate actions, regenerative agriculture, and other different systems of reforestation. These are adaptation measures focalized in solving this problem of deforestation. Use of soil is something not just of this basin, it's on a national level. So we have to better manage the natural soil or semi-natural soil, and the adaptation measure is an integrated management source for the basins, restoration, protection. The last part of this matrix, these issues associated to Cutzamala's basin, applying the methodology. For example, there's no scheme for formal and ongoing training to modify behaviors. This is a real issue. This has to do with knowledge, with behavior. This is part of the creation of capacities and empowerment. The specification is training and knowledge transfer. What is the adaptation measure that we are proposing? That the Autonomous University of Mexico and CIDA, which is a center for research to establish training capacities for adaptation to climate change. We have identified who can perform this task and who should. Step 4, which is implementation of these measures of the scoreboard. It says it is cross-cutting in the priorities. So then this is not the case. In the case of Mexico, there's no articulation between national and local. So here we should align public policy from the federation, from the state, from the municipalities, with the basin, with this criteria of climate risk. Should filter all the investment, all the actions, non-structural ones, with a vision of climate risk. And if we don't do it like that, we are not going to get to the goal, and we're going to be keeping on diluting the budget. Different policies that are being implemented and that are part of step 4, monitoring, assessment. This is very difficult in Mexico because we are not used to monitor. We don't like to evaluate, we don't like the results that we are expecting. So based on the methodology, we see the need of having a third party, impartial, to do this job. And on a basin level, it's more difficult than on a state level. We need to take advantage of the existing infrastructure of governance to focalize this, to do this monitoring and this assessment. We think that it's necessary to establish a center that can provide service to this basin of Guatemala, and also that this intelligence center for climate is not a building, but it's like a group of people doing this job that we think that can be established in the Autonomous University of the State of Mexico or in CIRA. Some final remarks. The planning of adaptation in the subnational case is urgent to update. We need to establish records and impact on climate change. Is not enough with what is being recorded by SENAPRED, because it's not necessarily correlated to climate change, because there's no filter that the impact is truly caused by climate change. It could be caused by variability in the climate, and there are differences.
We have to make vulnerability assessments, the profile of at the subnational level. It's not civilized. I mean, the states are not interested in the topic. That's something that we need to work on. We need to strengthen the action articulating national policies, subnational and municipalities. We need to provide assets from the ground up, so the next embassy in Mexico cannot only be what they think centrally, but what are the real problems of the state, of the municipality. So then Mexico can have a commitment, and then we have a real commitment from the states at a national level. And strengthening understanding and knowledge of these measures, it's quite valuable if we are possible to leverage the expertise and the methodology that the European Union are offering these projects, and we can take that. So this white paper, this document for policies can be a breakthrough, can be the milestone, so we can spread this to the rest of the states, starting from these 3-4 pilot projects. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions or on the chat at Zoom. Please. So it can be recorded. And the lecture was great. I mean, it really caught my attention. I'm from the Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México. I worked 15 years specifically in the environment protection management. I'm currently working in the environment management government of the state for ecological conservation. It really catches my attention when we talk about Guatemala because something that is not mentioned a lot is okay, yeah, Guatemala brings water to Mexico City, and that's great. Here in Mexico City, different municipalities or different towns, they charge the user, and then the user makes their own decision. So Guatemala to Mexico State, just fix it and make it nice because we need the water over here. When we were talking about resiliency, I really think that resiliency that needs to be covered in the basins, it's based a lot on environment education that there has to be on the populations near the basins. When we were taking coffee, I mean, I was talking about, hey, what's the problem with water? I mean, from Guatemala, it's climate change, of course, because Toluca had Huichican Kettle, that was in Navala Toluca, that doesn't have any snow anymore. And when it melts, that water goes to the basins and to Guatemala, and then we can have water supply. But right now, we don't have that problem. So, what would you propose? That's my question. What would you propose to heal this part with the town hall charging for water to the users? But the town hall, please provide maintenance to that system. So, that's my question. Thank you. One of the main issues regarding supply in this city is that it's basically based on having water guaranteed for granted. And the basin in Guatemala, excuse me, maybe I'm saying something quite quite disturbing, but Guatemala hasn't been managed correctly. That's the truth. Not by the municipalities, nor the state, and nor CONAGUA, the water commission. Having the water level so low, personally, I experienced it in 2006, 2007. And in those days, we made some decisions for not allowing that the Guatemala system can get to day zero, to the infamous day zero of the system, not for the supply for the city. The change of the use of the soil and to promote culture, not surveilling the the indigenous peoples that live there and that doesn't have water, and all infrastructure in Guatemala with a very low maintenance. That's what is giving the problem right now. And at the city in Valle de Mexico, in the basin here, what there are no actions regarding the investment for maintenance and keep it working. That's the reality. Yesterday, I had a talk with Kathy and with Elise, that is the head of the conservation program, and I was telling them that in other countries, we were checking Brazil and Costa Rica just as examples that are quite relevant. In the utility bill, they charge for the maintenance for the basin. In that bill, they charge for the payment for environment resources that goes directly to this system. I'm not talking about London, that base water charges for the use of the basin there. I'm talking about Latin America here. So it is possible to do it, but again, if there's the will, if there is the political will to do it, so we have to align this willness from everyone and what we are committing ourselves with the needs, with subnational needs of the basin. I think there's a key. If we get to include in the bills that the people in the cities to understand what is and how much is it for maintaining the basins, then we're going to change the mindset of the Mexican people. I think that's the road to follow. The example of how Europe is covering this, it has to be an example for us that we can implement it. Evidently, not from one day to another, but little by little. Thank you. It was very interesting, and I think you already explained it, but I wanted to cover this issue about budget. I mean, what's the baseline? What is the budget that we have currently, or how much we are investing currently in order to provide maintenance to the water infrastructure? And not only engineering, but should we add restoration and environment adaptation based on ecosystems? So, what would be the estimation? I don't know. Um, it's we know that it's about 10% annually in the aware of environmentally speaking. So how much we should invest in environment restoration? I don't have the number, but I can answer that question a different way with an approximation. Mexico, in order to recover the basins, in order to avoid exploiting the watersheds, in order to improve spreading, to guarantee what it's called water safety, food safety, and to protect ourselves from floodings. A value that it's mentioned is 100,000 million pesos for the next 30 years, Mexican pesos. In this administration and at the end of the previous administration, what was invested in federal infrastructure maintenance was zero. So we're not only looking forward to the future, but we are not taking care of the fixed assets that Mexico has. That's a very big problem. We are not investing on science or technology. So let's remember what are the components of the European Union environment strategy. Management knowledge is one of them, and Mexico is not investing on that. And not even vulnerability or climate risks, something that it's happening right now. Mexico is not investing on ensuring water safety, ensuring water, that it's a fundamental element of the components of this European strategy. So we are not taking care for everyone to have water. And I'm not only talking about people living in the cities, but people who live on the field, in communities, for agriculture, for the industry. We're all thinking that there's always going to be water, and that's not true. And we cannot disconnect water, resource, basin, biodiversity. To only see water, and the most typical case, it's Guatemala. In Guatemala, they provide maintenance at least to the hydrological system, but they're not taking care for having water flowing to where they need to be, where there's need to be water. That's an example that we're doing things incorrectly because we are not connecting the basin with the resource, with water and the usage. Please. Thank you. This is the last question because we know that a lot of people at Zoom have questions. We'll be taking note and we'll be sending answers to them for not delaying too long with the speakers and the people online. Thank you. I am Fatima Lara. I think different from the people here. I come from a hospital. I come from Centro Médico ABC. My question is more focused on communication with the population. Shouldn't that be an adaptation strategy, communication for information for the people? I'm saying this because, I mean, dealing with all the people that I have talked about this topic, how the hospital has to establish a strategy with this issue that we have, that there's no water because a hospital cannot be without water. But what people says is that it hasn't rained. That's why there's no water. But it will rain. Then the water levels will be reestablished, and this is just a phase. Or the leakages on Mexico City. We have to fix the leaks, and we will solve that. So again, my question would be communication to the population, not only environment education, but to really communicate how the situation is and to communicate that it's not only about not raining. I think that must be, I would say, on the policies for adaptation and resiliency. You are completely right, and I will give you an example about that. Australia suffered from what it was called the millennium dryness. All the Australia cities were on risk on what happened on Cabo, near close to day zero. Barcelona suffered a very hard problem on 2004, 2007. Sao Paulo, Los Angeles. Analyzing all these cases in an assessment of good European practices, it was identified that what contributes the most in order to face this phenomenon was one policy, permanent policy regarding communication to the population about the situation and what were the measures that were taken. For sure, adaptation, it is a very similar case and as relevant as communication, as you said it. People think that when it rains, the problem will be solved, and that's completely false. That's not true because they are not relating what's the resource. They don't know what are their supply resources. They don't know that the most important thing for supply in the city are the watersheds or the wells. And the watershed, it's not reacting like in Yucatan, where we have rainwater and then they react immediately. And here in Mexico, it's completely different. And we make the mistake here that it rains and we try to take water as fast as possible instead of re-leveraging it. We mix it with residual water and we try to take it out. We are not adapted to these circumstances. But communication, therefore, it's very important for people to know what's the situation now, what we're doing regarding that. And that's what I was saying about assessment and monitoring. We are not used to monitoring or to be assessed if we are doing things right or not. Thank you. Thank you, Mario. Thank you very much. Give it up for him. And thank you to all the people for your questions. Thank you, Mario, for talking about the financing schemes and monitoring and assessment, the necessity for variability and vulnerability assessment, as well as how we can really take this topic about subnational policies to adaptation issues.